Green New Deal. Sounds like the light at the end of the tunnel for those of us who oppose nuclear energy, doesn't it? But wait, there are loopholes aplenty in the wording of that proposal that could allow for the nukesters, backed by their lobbyists, PR flacks, NGOs, and dark money, to claim that they're green too, and then horn in on the action. How is this even possible? Well, when you hear a genuine expert explain it all to you, and she says,
environmentalists have allowed the nuclear industry to claim that they are a clean energy source without calling them out or holding them to account for the radioactive waste they produce and all the carbon and fossil fuels that are used in the process of creating the fuel for a nuclear reactor and all the nuclear waste that's produced afterward. They have a huge carbon footprint.
Oops! Well, when you hear the truth laid out like that, you start to realize that the light at the end of the tunnel may just be a nuclear freight train bearing down on us all. And you realize that, once again, as always, there is this uncomfortable seat that we all share.
Nuclear hot seat, what are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat, what have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat, the corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat, it's the bomb.
Welcome to Nuclear Hot Seat, the weekly international news magazine keeping you up to date on all things nuclear from a different perspective. My name is Libby Halevi. I am the producer and host, as well as a survivor of the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island from just 1 mile away. So I know what can happen when those nuclear so-called experts get it wrong. This week, we springboard off last week's new Green Deal announcement to examine exactly what that means in nuclear terms, something I suspect we'll be doing on this show for a lot of weeks to come. We'll hear from Gail Snyder, board president of the Nuclear Energy Information Service, or NEIS, which is headquartered in Chicago. She takes us through the languaging of the Green New Deal and shows how it reflects long-standing strategies used by the nuclear industry to try to co-opt the climate change argument and paint themselves as carbon neutral, which they definitely are not. Then we revisit a talk given by Arnie Gunderson, chief engineer at Fairwinds Energy Education, on global warming and climate change, and why nuclear truly has no skin in that game and cannot do anything to bail us out. We will also have nuclear news from around the world, numbnuts of the week for outstanding nuclear boneheadedness, and more honest nuclear information than currently appears in the Green New Deal. All of it coming up in just a few moments. Today is Tuesday, February 12th, 2019, and here is this week's nuclear news from a different perspective. The Green New Deal to combat climate change was announced in the United States last week by Senator Ed Markey and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as she's known. The confusion and debate about what it means regarding nuclear energy started almost immediately. At first, exclusion of nukes from the deal was clarified in an FAQ we thought was from AOC's office as meaning no nuclear, period, end of discussion. Then that was removed from the FAQ, and word was that maybe they only meant no nuclear. Let's keep the old ones. Then Markey rolled back the maybe no nuke stance by saying the Green New Deal was technologically neutral. To sort through what all this doublespeak means, we spoke with Gail Snyder, board president of Nuclear Energy Information Service, or NEIS, a Chicago-based anti-nuclear group.
Gail Snyder, great that you could join us on Nuclear Hot Seat.
Thank you for having me.
So, clear things up for us. Is nuclear in or out of the Green New Deal?
Yeah, everyone has been trying to figure that out, and it was in and it was out, and it was old nukes, and now there's kind of a window for old nukes and maybe new small modular nuclear reactors. So I think what everyone has to take a look at here is that the nuclear industry has a strategy, and the strategy is often to include nuclear without exactly saying so. And I've seen it in many environmental discussions and legislative resolution, lots of broad terms allowing for nuclear to put its big radioactive foot in the door. And I'm really seeing this as the same strategy in the Green New Deal. The way things have changed and evolved in the way the resolution has finally turned out, we have to be able to really identify these techniques so that we can call them out and know what we're really dealing with on a state, national, and even global level. And there are a few things that the industry does that you can start to identify. And I think this is good for, the layperson, the interested person who's interested in environmental issues, and a person who's really actively working on environmental policy, because I think sometimes it even sneaks by them because they might be so focused on carbon they don't see what's kind of coming at them.
What are some of the strategies being used to confuse the issue and possibly sneak nukes in?
This is how the nuclear industry keeps its foot in the door while everyone is so focused on carbon. The first strategy is not to mention nuclear energy at all. So they don't want to include it, therefore it can't be excluded later. So it's always available as an option. And one of the ways they do it is they have vague terms that could include nuclear energy, so when it eventually is included, nobody can ever claim that they said it was out. So such environmental obfuscation can include the terms all of the above strategy, which means any possible energy source, including nuclear. Or they could use the term, we're looking at technologically neutral sources of energy, which means nuclear could include it. And yes, unfortunately, even the word clean or any combination such as clean, renewable or clean and renewable. This is because environmentalists have allowed the nuclear industry to claim that they are a clean energy source without calling them out or holding them to account for the radioactive waste they produce and all the carbon and fossil fuels that are used in the process of creating the fuel for a nuclear reactor and all the nuclear waste that's produced afterward. They have a huge carbon footprint. Number 3 is never ever mention nuclear waste. And while much of the talk about a carbon footprint may occur, no talk of nuclear energy's radioactive waste footprint shall be mentioned. Every time someone talks about preventing carbon emissions, they should also be talking about preventing nuclear waste. If they don't, they're either uninformed or they're deliberately not mentioning nuclear waste, and you should be asking why not. Number 4 is mention of nuclear energy that cannot be avoided will immediately turn into nuclear energy is 100% carbon-free, which it's not, because I just explained how we use lots of fossil fuels in the whole nuclear fuel cycle. Then they switch over to start talking about small modular nuclear reactors. And yes, please include the N for nuclear and small modular nuclear reactors. This is one of the ways that rule number 1 comes into play, which is don't mention nuclear. So small modular nuclear reactors used to have the term nuclear in them, but now they've just changed to small modular reactors. Because when you take out the word nuclear, people don't think about it. You get the lay person to not consider that they're talking about nuclear energy and all that comes with it. You even get some environmentalists to kind of be blindsided and not tune in to they're talking about nuclear energy and radioactive waste when you're talking about small modular nuclear reactors. And why they throw out small modular nuclear reactors is they say that it's going to be this, regional power supply and they're going to be mass produced, but they don't exist in reality, and they take great sums of taxpayer dollars to develop. All that time and money wasted when we should be fully investing in renewable energy. So the Green New Deal has changed some of its language from what it seemed like it was originally going to be to leave these doors open. And it's a shame, and we all need to pay attention because nuclear energy has a space there to get a big seat at the table. And I hope it's not a big seat.
Well, they do have a big budget to be able to push their way in if they want to. So what can those of us who are more aware, and I must admit that I've been picking up the term small modular reactors, and I will from now on forever include the word nuclear in the middle. Thank you for that course correction. But beyond a bit of languaging, what can we, the people, do to raise public awareness before, unfortunately, this country may drink the nuclear Kool-Aid?
I think the number one place to start really is your elected representatives. You have to learn more about this, and anyone who's listening to your program is well informed, and you have to educate your representatives both on a state and national level, because as this pieces of legislations come out in support of and claiming they are part of a Green New Deal type of legislation, they have to be examined with this kind of a screening going forward and saying, where does nuclear come into play on every piece of legislation that would come through? Is nuclear included, or is there a window for it? And legislators, we all like to think our legislators know everything, but they have so many things coming at them, you'd be surprised that, some people just don't understand the legislation that's put before them. And that is our role as individuals concerned about any issue, is to be tuned into the issue and red flag it when you see it coming for a legislator. Of course, letting your friends and neighbors know and everything is great, but this is moving fast, this Green New Deal, and what may happen with it may happen rapidly. And so the best place to go is where it's happening. And it's happening on a legislative level, and that's where we need to talk to people.
Gail Snyder, Board President of NEIS in Chicago. We will have more on nukes and the delusion that they are useful in fighting climate change in today's feature with Arnie Gunderson of Fairwinds Energy Education, which will be coming up shortly. And of course, we will be covering the battle over the Green New Deal very closely in the coming weeks. Moving right along, there's a nuclear policy chain reaction happening. First, the United States pulled out of the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, which banned intermediate range ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons between both countries. Within 24 hours, Russia did the same. Both countries claimed that the other one violated terms of the treaty. Then, 3 days later, on Tuesday, February 5th, U.S., Russia, and France all launched nuclear-capable missiles within hours of one another. None of the tests were said to have been equipped with nuclear warheads. And each of the three countries has claimed that these tests were scheduled far ahead of time. And isn't this a coincidence? Then Trump said in last Tuesday's State of the Union address that the U.S. may be open to negotiating another agreement to replace the 1987 INF treaty. And within 24 hours, Russia announced that it welcomed an offer by Trump to renegotiate this landmark nuclear missile pact. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov told reporters in Moscow on Thursday, "When our American colleagues actually get to the point where they give us something concrete, we will look at this with interest and I hope in a positive way." Yeah, you, me, and the rest of humanity. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has put out a paper, "Russia may have violated the INF Treaty. Here's how the United States appears to have done the same." We'll post a link to it up on our website, nuclearhotseat.com, under this episode, number 399. Also linked will be an article by Bob Alvarez, senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, on how plutonium waste from the U.S. nuclear weapons complex appears to be significantly higher than the U.S. Department of Energy's 1996 declaration of its plutonium holdings. HBO has announced that their miniseries Chernobyl is as close to reality as possible within 5 hours. I don't know if it's the production that is close to reality or what they're presenting is supposed to be close to reality. But here's hoping they do not whitewash the radiation contamination and its ongoing impact to health and genetic safety. Over to Japan, where Kansai Electric Power Company has informed Fukui Prefecture that restarts of the Takahama nuclear power plants Units 1 and 2 and Unit 3 of the Mahama plant has been delayed as work to bolster safety measures will now take longer than originally expected. How predictable. Here's the dangerous part. The upgrades are aimed at preparing the 3 units for operation beyond 40 years. That was the plan for operational life of these nuclear reactors when they were first commissioned. They were never meant to go beyond 40 years because radiation bombardment creates a condition called embrittlement, or a weakening of the structure and the containment. But hey, when there's money to be made, nuclear's blind spots are all strategically placed. As a reminder of what can go wrong, a 2011 article has been making the rounds on social media again, and it deserves another look. It's entitled, "Fukushima Nuclear Plant Released Far More Radiation Than Government Said," and we will link to it. Last week, we told you how below freezing temperatures on Thursday, January 31st, shut down the Salem nuclear reactor in New Jersey. Now, from Japan comes information that a fire extinguisher system broke down at Hokkaido Electric Power's Tomari nuclear power plant because of record cold weather. It affected equipment designed to maintain water pressure in the event of firefighting at the 2 reactors. All of the plant's reactors have been offline since 2012 following the Fukushima nuclear accident. And now,
Nuclear hot seat, nuclear hot seat, nuclear hot seat, nuts of the week.
Japan's Reconstruction Agency is going to air ads for Fukushima products on TV, online, and at cinemas. The 30-second spot is aimed at dispelling harmful rumors, aka the truth, about the safety of products from the prefecture. Because nothing gets rid of dangerous levels of nuclear radiation like a good piece of well-placed propaganda. And that's why, Japan Reconstruction Agency, you are this week's
Nuclear hot seat, nuts of the week.
Over to France, where Greenpeace has struck again. At the Orano nuclear plant in La Hague, Greenpeace used a drone to drop flares of distress on the roof of the storage pool for irradiated fuel to vividly illustrate the vulnerability of this nuclear site. Alex Mazzoni, in charge of Campaign Energy for Greenpeace France, said Greenpeace has demonstrated once again that the nuclear facilities of France are not adequately protected against the risk of external aggression. This drone is able to turn on the smoke of distress on the roof of the swimming pool. That's the spent fuel pool. The weak point of a building containing the largest quantity of radioactive material in the world. Yay, Greenpeace in Europe. What in the world are you doing in the U.S., if anything? And from Dr. Gordon Edwards of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility comes word that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is lobbying to have small modular nuclear reactors exempted from any form of public environmental assessment process. What the public doesn't know really can hurt them. And in Switzerland, a worker at the Liebstadt nuclear power plant near Zurich was found to have fabricated data on safety tests that were not even performed. The employee failed to perform biannual tests on 3 mobile radiation measuring devices since 2016. The devices need to be tested to ensure they function properly. Instead, the worker entered fabricated data into the inspection logs. George Schwartz, deputy director of the Swiss Federal Nuclear Safety Inspectorate, said, "Unfortunately, this case is not an isolated one. Steps must now be taken to sustainably improve the safety culture at this facility." Ya think? We'll have this week's featured interview in just a moment. But first, it's one thing for me to come on each week and ask for your support, for donations to keep this show running. But this week, I was surprised far beyond anything I could reasonably expect. Last Sunday, Hervé Courtois, the seemingly tireless French activist, writer, and researcher, whose work appears at Fukushima 311 Watchdogs, nuclear-news.net, and deunrenard.wordpress.com, surprised me by posting the following on the Facebook page of the Coalition Against Nukes. Hervé wrote, in June 2011, Libby Halevi started her weekly podcast, Nuclear Hot Seat. This coming week, it will be the 399th episode of Nuclear Hot Seat. In Libby's near 400 episodes, she has interviewed all the people involved in anti-nuclear, on-the-ground activists, physicians, scientists, writers. She has attended events, symposia, uranium film festivals, etc. She has relentlessly produced Nuclear Hot Seat every week for almost 8 years. Her work is very valuable and quite irreplaceable to educate all of us and the general public about anything regarding nuclear, and not only in the U.S., but all over the world, as her Nuclear Hot Seat podcast has listeners and is downloaded in more than 123 countries. And you know what? She has accomplished all that on a shoestring budget, a miracle in itself. Libby Halevi needs our full support to continue her irreplaceable, excellent work. And that means we have to support her work with whatever funding we can spare. Any amount donated is well put to use for her various expenses, travel, and others. Hervé then cited my having been at 3 Mile Island when the nuclear accident happened in 1979, my intention to attend the 40th anniversary this March, and my need for support to cover expenses if I'm to get there. Wow. I did not ask for this statement. I was surprised and humbled by it. And now I'm passing it along to you. So please, do what you can to support my work on Nuclear Hot Seat and my return to 3 Mile Island for its 40th anniversary. You can go to our website, nuclearhotseat.com, and click on the big red donate button to donate any amount. You can also sign up to give monthly $5 donations by clicking on the big green donate button. My deep gratitude to Hervé Courtois for what he wrote, and to you for whatever you are moved to do to support the show. Here are this week's featured interviews. In all the noise about the Green New Deal, what's been missing from mainstream media has been a calm, logical, and informed discussion of why nuclear does not belong in the mix. To give us a baseline on talking points that everyone who opposes nuclear energy can use, we have 2 interviews this week. The first is with Gail Snyder, a longtime member and now board chair of the Nuclear Energy Information Service, or NEIS, a Chicago-based nonprofit organization committed to ending nuclear power and advocating for sustainable, ecologically sound, and socially just energy solutions. Gail and I talked about how in the world the Green New Deal could even vaguely entertain nuclear reactors as part of its agenda. We talked just yesterday, Monday, February 11, 2019. Here's this week's special feature. In terms of exactly how and why nuclear has managed to wrap itself in this green mantle, and why this makes absolutely no sense in the climate change conversation, nobody explains it better than Arnie Gunderson. Arnie is the chief engineer at Fairwinds Energy Education, a former licensed nuclear reactor operator, and a whistleblower. On Sunday, December 3, 2017, Arnie spoke at the Third Unitarian Church, located not far from the University of Chicago, and its orgy of self-congratulations over the 75th anniversary of the first atomic pile. Arnie took the opportunity to give the best explanation of global warming that I have ever heard. He then followed the money to connect climate change to the reality of what nuclear reactors actually do and do not do, in light of their highly touted, quote-unquote, carbon-free argument. Listen up and take notes. This one has languaging that's a keeper. It first aired on Nuclear Hot Seat number 338 on December 12, 2017.
I wanted to talk about Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We all know the story where the porridge was, one was too hot, one was too cold, and one was just right. Well, in astronomy, there's a term called the Goldilocks zone, which around a star, there's a place that's neither too hot, like Mercury, it's a little bit too hot there, or too cold, like Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. And the Earth and Venus happen to be in that Goldilocks zone, where There's enough heat to have water in liquid form. Now, Venus you'll see it sometimes early in the morning or at sunset or sunrise. It's a very bright star. In fact, it's a planet. And it's our closest neighbor. It's about 65 million miles from the sun. And the Earth is 93 million miles from the sun. But that zone, water should exist in liquid form. Anybody know how hot it is on Venus?
600 degrees.
It's like 900 degrees, right? So why is Venus in the, quote, Goldilocks zone where liquid water should exist? Why is it 900 degrees? Because its atmosphere has loaded with carbon dioxide. So when anybody says that CO2 doesn't cause global warming, just ask the people that used to live on Venus. Yeah. If you do the math, if Venus had an atmosphere like Earth, it would be about 165 degrees. So it would be hot, there's no doubt about it, but liquid water could exist. So in order for life to exist, you need liquid water. So now let's go to the third rock from the sun, that's us. The Earth is, imagine the Earth as an apple. Well, the part that we live in, the biosphere, the habitable part of that apple is as thick as the skin on the apple. That's it. The rest of the planet is uninhabitable. So, essentially the atmosphere up to 40,000 feet, geese have been known to fly over the Himalayas. So in theory, things can exist up at about 40,000 feet, down to the bottom of a trench in the Pacific, and that could be about 8 miles deep. So 8 miles high to 8 miles deep is essentially as thick as the skin on the apple. Now, what's happened over the years is the Earth was warmer than it is now back when the dinosaurs roamed the Earth. And not only were there dinosaurs, but there was a lot of plants. And our air has always contained carbon dioxide. And for the last millennia, many millennia, the concentration of carbon dioxide has been about 280 parts per million. That's the steady state carbon dioxide essentially since the dinosaurs died. It's been around 280 parts per million. What part per million is, if I've got a million air molecules, 280 of them are going to be carbon dioxide. That's been a steady state number for years and for decades and centuries and eons, essentially since the dinosaurs died. But before that, we had higher concentrations of carbon, and we had an awful lot of plants. We all know we exhale carbon dioxide, and plants absorb carbon dioxide. So all these plants absorbed that carbon dioxide, died, and then through geological processes over time, that carbon got taken out of the skin of the apple and brought down below that. So that carbon was removed from the part of the planet that we have an influence on. So about 200 years ago, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, mankind discovered, hey, we can burn coal to run steam engines or heat our homes. And we began to dig down below that skin of the apple and pull up some of that old carbon. And ever since then, carbon dioxide has been growing in the atmosphere from 280 to, when I was born, about 300 parts per million. So there was a very gradual, over 200 years, carbon dioxide did go up. How do people know that? They know it because of ice cores. They drill down into glaciers, and they, the Greenland ice pack or whatever, and they can sample what the atmosphere was like at different points in time, back thousands and thousands of years. And with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when mankind was able to puncture the skin of the apple and get below it, get to all these dead dinosaurs and all the dead plants that had turned to coal and oil and natural gas, now we started to bring that carbon up to the surface again. So when we started to burn fossil fuels, essentially at the Industrial Revolution, 1700 roughly, carbon dioxide began gradually to increase. So with that as an introduction, let's go to when I was born. And somebody really smart in Hawaii in the 1960s at a place called Mauna Loa began to measure the carbon carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every year. And so when you hear the Mauna Loa data, it goes back to 1960, and somebody has been continuously tracking carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since then. So we were running along for thousands and thousands of years at 280, and then it started to gradually go up, and when I was born it was 300 to 310 roughly. And then it began to increase, and the one slide I'll be using today is the one that's up there. On the left is it's a red spiky slide, and it shows the Mauna Loa data. And no one is disputing this Mauna Loa data. It's scientifically proven. Now you'll see it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, but the trend of the line is always up. And what's happening there is every summer carbon dioxide drops because plants absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And every winter carbon dioxide goes up. But the trend of the line is upward because mankind is throwing more carbon into the atmosphere every year. So that's the Mauna Loa data. Now, what happened, you've heard of Bill McKibben and 350.org? He gets his 350 from the concentration in the atmosphere of 350 parts per million. And a lot of scientists say that's the red line. Now that we're over 350, the climate will change. And we're not just over it by a little bit. We're now over it by 50 parts per million. We're up at over 400 parts per million in carbon. So remember now, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we're at 280, and 310 by the time I was born. So just barely, 10% went up a little bit. And now since 1960, it's screamed upward from 310 to 400. McKibben chose 350. It's right around the same time that James Hansen said that carbon dioxide is a real problem and it's going to affect the climate. So McKibben's goal in 350.org is to turn the curve around, to turn the Mauna Loa data around and get it to go back down. And the world that we're used to, the world where you can go skiing in the winter and and mountains actually have snow on them and things like that, only exists if the CO2 levels can stabilize at 350. So lesson number one is we're in trouble. That's what the Mauna Loa data shows. The curve next to it is something that Fairwind's put together. We had 4 interns and 2 PhDs working for a year to get the curve on the right there. Then I need to introduce another term. And I promise there will only be 2 terms: parts per million and gigatons. You know, when you've got your computer has megabytes and then gigabytes and then terabytes. Giga is a term, and it means 1,000 million is a giga. So when we talk about gigatons, we talk about 1,000 million tons. In America, I could say billion, but the Brits and the Japanese have different terms for it. So the scientific community says giga to confuse people and make us think that they're smarter than we are. But so anyway, mankind's throwing up a lot of dead dinosaurs into the atmosphere every year. And we're throwing up, right now, about 36 gigatons per year. 36,000 million tons, 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. That's a big number. And it's roughly the equivalent of the amount of dead dinosaurs that died in 1 million years. So every year we're sucking out 1 million years worth of carbon dioxide that's been stored below the skin of the apple and throwing that back into the atmosphere. So there's a definite correlation here. They're both going up. Parts per million are going up at about 2 parts per million a year, and mankind's been throwing carbon into the atmosphere at a little less than an extra gigaton a year for the last, essentially since I've been in the nuclear industry. So there's a definite correlation. The more CO2 we throw up, the more we become like Venus, and the less we become like the Earth that we knew about. So let's just keep that up there, keep it in mind, and now I'll talk about nuclear power and its relationship to global warming. I got out of college in 71 with a bachelor's and 72 with my master's in nuclear engineering. And that was at the beginning of the There were very few nuclear plants when I started college, and 20 years later, there's 450 of them. So it was the first boom in nuclear power. Since about 1990, there haven't been many more because of economics. And actually, Forbes magazine said that building those 450 nuclear power plants was, and this is their words, the biggest managerial disaster in the history of business. And that was in 1985. Now, Forbes is not an anti-nuke outfit. I mean, they have no dog in the fight. They're business. So America's commitment to build over 100 nukes and the world's commitment to build 450 nukes was the biggest managerial disaster in the history of business, according to Forbes magazine. So now let's get to Illinois. Illinois has the most nukes of any state in the union. And, of course, you're aware that there's been a big bailout of the nuclear plants in Illinois. I can assure you, I built these plants. I worked at Dresden down the road here by about 50 miles. I worked up at Zion. I worked at Quad Cities and Braidwood during my career. But when those plants were built, nobody built them about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide wasn't even on the radar back in the 70s when these plants were built. So now the nuclear industry is saying, whoa, we need these nukes because of carbon dioxide. That's a marketing ploy. But they were not built because of that. You might remember in the 70s we had these gas lines and things like that. They were built because there was an energy shortage. We were running out of energy. We needed nuclear power to displace oil. That didn't happen. But in fact, those nukes, carbon dioxide was never on the agenda. Right around the year 2000, as these old nukes were aging and becoming more expensive to run, they latched on to the marketing ploy, oh my God, nukes are going to save the world from carbon dioxide buildup. So I want to set aside the desecration of Native American lands from mining, forget about the desecration of Fukushima and Chernobyl from disasters, and let's not worry about storing nuclear waste for 250,000 years. Let's set all that aside, and we'll just talk about money. Okay, so this is the next little bit here is about money. The nuclear plants that are out there now do displace some carbon dioxide. And so 450 nuclear plants, let's look at the gigatons. 36 gigatons is what we are throwing up into the world through our cars, through heating, through everything, every year. Now, if we didn't have those 450 nukes, this is an audience participation piece here. If we didn't have those 450 nukes, how much more gigatons do you think we would throw up? Well, I'll give you the bands. 5%, 10%, 20%, and 50% more gigatons of carbon dioxide going up into the atmosphere. So show of hands. So who thinks if we didn't have those 450 nukes, if they had never been built, how much worse would it be? 5%? Okay, about half the group. 10%? Oh, about the other half of the group. 20%? And 50%. Okay, so the group is saying 5 to 10% seems to be the consensus here. Well, at Fairwinds, what we did was we used nuclear industry data from one of their international websites, and the real answer is if we didn't have all those nukes, there would be 1 gigaton more for all of them. 1 gigaton more would be thrown into the atmosphere, or 3%. So the group that said 5%, that was the right answer. Nukes are only eliminating 3% of the carbon dioxide that's getting thrown into the atmosphere now. And that's all of them. That's all 450 of them. So worldwide, 450 worldwide nukes. And in the U.S., we've got 100. In Illinois, I think you've got 18. Is that right?
11 operating.
11 operating, okay. So then what you do is you take 3% and you divide it by 450, and each nuclear power plant is reducing global gases into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, by 0.007%, 7 thousandths of 1%. So when you hear that argument that, oh my God, if we shut down Quad Cities, all the polar bears are going to die, it's just not true. It's an inconsequential amount. We talk about nuclear taking a bite out of climate change. Nuclear is taking a nibble out of climate change. So when we look at where we are now, nuclear hasn't bent the curve. And in fact, if you talk to climate scientists, they say if we had spent all that money in that, quote, managerial disaster on renewables, we would be much better off than with the 450 nukes that we have today. So that's where we are today. We're throwing up 36 gigatons, and without nukes, we'd be throwing up 37 gigatons, 3% more. And the question is, did we spend the money correctly back in the 80s and 70s? Could it have been better spent? It's spent. We can't worry about it. It's water under the bridge. Now let's look forward into 2050, so 35 years out, roughly. And the nuclear industry has said that in order to combat global warming, we need 1,000 new nuclear plants. 1,000 new nuclear plants. And they never say that the other part of that is that it's going to take us 35 years to build them, and it's going to cost $8.2 trillion to build them. Now, and that number, the $8.2 trillion, comes from the investment banking firm Lazard. Now, so they don't have a dog in this fight either. It's not like I'm relying on Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth or any, quote, anti-nuclear organization. This is banks and the nuclear industry that the information I'm sharing it with. So the nuclear industry says that they need 1,000 new nukes, and they don't say the other half of that. And, oh, by the way, it's going to cost $8.2 trillion to build. So the question, there's this thing in economics called the opportunity cost. And the question is, if you spend 8.2 on nukes, 8.2 trillion, could that money have been better spent on something else? This is a discussion the United States should have had back in 1970 or 1960 during that first boom, but we didn't. And so we have 450 nukes that we are essentially living with. But do we have to double down on that bet and add 1,000 more? First off, 1,000 new nukes means that a new nuclear plant would have to go online just about every 10 or 12 days between now and 2050. And there is no infrastructure to do that. The colleges that used to teach nuclear engineering aren't anymore. The facilities that are capable of building a nuclear reactor or turbines or all of the nuclear components aren't capable of building one every 12 days. The engineering schools just are not there, and the engineering talent is not there to build that many power plants in that time span. So there's an infrastructure issue that how could we ever do that anyway? But hey, when there's $8.2 trillion on the line, I'm sure somebody will figure out a way to make that happen. So MIT has done a study, and MIT actually has a Tokyo Electric chair in their nuclear department. So again, they're certainly not anti-nuclear. And MIT says that these gigatons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are going to grow to about 60 gigatons per year, even if the United States and other nations implement the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords are the thing that the Trump administration is trying to get us out of. Even if we were in that game and everybody else was in that game, the CO2 would still increase to about 60 gigatons over the next 35 years. So why is that? The answer is everybody wants to live like us. The people in India want their car and their air conditioning. The people in China want their car and their air conditioning. South Asia wants a car and air conditioning. Africa wants their car and air conditioning. South America wants their car and air conditioning. And you can't begrudge people for wanting to live like we do. So if that trend were to continue, we would be at 60 gigatons per year, even if the best efforts of COP21, the Paris Accords, took effect. And those MIT numbers assume 1,000 new nukes are built. So the key here is that it takes 35 years to build them. And there's this concept, in addition to opportunity cost, the fact of the matter is that global climate change isn't going to say, well, we'll take a vacation for 35 years while you build those nukes. It's still growing. And the midpoint of 35 years is 17 years, at 2 parts per million a year, global warming is going to increase by 32 parts per million while we're building those nukes. So what percent of that 60 gigatons will these new nukes take a bite out of? And the answer is 6%. So the nuclear industry would like to have us spend $8 trillion to solve 6% of the problem. And oh, by the way, we're going to take 35 years to solve it. And to my way of thinking, and to an awful lot of people's way of thinking, that doesn't make economic sense. Forget the indigenous lands, forget the odds are there'll be a meltdown like Chernobyl or Fukushima, about 50-50 odds in the next 10 years. Push all that stuff aside and just talk about the money. Does it make sense to invest $8.2 trillion to solve 6% of the problem? Now, this opportunity cost number that economists use is, I think, is a critical concept here. And that's basically, if I commit to spend $8.2 trillion on nuclear, that's $8.2 trillion I can't spend on renewables or energy conservation or any of those alternatives. Well, it turns out that, let's get back to money now. We're putting aside all the insults to the environment. Get back to money. A new nuke, electricity is measured at something called bus bar cost. And as it leaves the power plant, for an existing nuke, it's about 6 or 8 cents to create the kilowatt of electricity that leaves the power plant. Now, you pay more than that. Your bill is higher than 8 cents a kilowatt. And that's because after it leaves the power plant, there's distribution and transmission costs to get it to you. But the cost of the power plant is 6 to 8 cents for a power plant today. These new nukes are now so expensive that the bus bar cost, the cost as it leaves the boundary and heads out into the grid, is going to be about 20 cents a kilowatt, compared to 2 cents right now for solar. So a new nuke is 10 times more expensive than an electric watt generated by solar. Now people will say, well, yeah, but solar's intermittent. So let's go to Elon Musk and throw one of his batteries on, and solar plus one of Musk's batteries is around 6 or 8 cents, and that number's declining. So a grid of distributed power, thousands of solar collectors or windmills or whatever, linked together with a storage system, is at least half as cheap as a nuclear baseload alternative. So I think what's going to happen here is that 100 years from now, when a historian looks back on what we're going through right now, they're going to say that this is not about being pro-nuke or anti-nuke. It's really not. It's a change in the paradigm. When I was building nukes, we had to build central powers because we didn't have the technology that has developed for solar collectors. And we didn't have the ability with computers to connect small distributed loads. We needed a big power plant, and perhaps for Illinois there's probably a couple hundred, including the nukes, to do that. But times have changed. Just like we don't have to be connected into a central phone system anymore, the computers have replaced that. Or just like my computer I don't need to go to a mainframe to do a calculation anymore. I can do that. What's happened is that the grid is changing from a central station paradigm in the 20th century to a 21st century paradigm of a distributed network. And the battle that we're in, I think when you look back 100 years from now, will not be about, I was an anti-nuke or I was a pro-nuke. The battle is, the world is changing, and the central station people, including the people we heard at the University of Chicago and the need for nuclear, those people are trapped in a 20th century paradigm. But the 21st century paradigm is going to be one of thousands of interconnected small collectors that, in fact, talk to each other. Now, that exists right now. Denmark has changed from a system of about 20 or 30 or 40 large power plants to a system of hundreds of windmills and solar and garbage burners. Denmark actually is importing garbage from Germany to run their trash plants instead of relying on coal or oil. Now, I should mention one other thing about biomass. We talk about burning coal. Now, that's going underneath that layer of the apple and pulling up old carbon and throwing it up in the air. When you burn wood, and in Burlington, Vermont, where I'm from, we have a wood-burning power plant, it produces carbon, but that carbon was already in the skin of the apple. So burning biomass, whatever it is, wood or grass or whatever, burning biomass doesn't change the total amount of carbon in the skin of the apple. What it does do is produce power, and there's no increase in carbon dioxide. It's only when we drill through the skin of the apple and suck up that carbon, or in oil or gas, or when we dig it up with coal, that we take carbon that's below the skin of the apple and pull it up into the atmosphere. So one of the things that's happened in the last 3 years is that the curve on the right has flattened out. We have been going up at a little less than a gigaton a year, but for the last 2 years it's flattened out. And that's a fascinating trend. What's happened there is that China is building more renewables and shutting down their coal plants. China has cut back on the amount of carbon dioxide that it's throwing up in the atmosphere. So the curve has leveled out as far as gigatons getting thrown in the atmosphere. But guess what? The ppms are still going up. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, even though we're not adding any more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we still are adding 36 new gigatons every year, and the ppms are still going up at roughly 2 ppm per year. Now that's frightening, and what that says is that the ability of the Earth to absorb that carbon dioxide is maxed out. The Earth can't absorb anymore into the oceans or into the rainforests or wherever that carbon dioxide has been going. So we need to come up with technologies that are cheap, certainly cheaper than nuclear, and fast. I can build the equivalent of 50 power plants using solar in the time it takes to build one nuclear, and for roughly the same price. And so that's the key. The climate change is a now problem. And to talk about, well, maybe we should develop fusion power, and that's going to be 50 years from now before we get the first one, or traveling wave, or Bill Gates says that small modulars are the way to go. All of those are solutions of which the first power plant may come online 20 years from now. 20 years is too late for the first one. We need a system, a distributed system, that solves the problem right now. And luckily for us, it's available. It wasn't available when I was building power plants, but it is now, and that's a distributed system, and it's cheaper, and it's faster, and it works.
During the Q&A that followed, Arnie addressed the opportunities provided by energy efficiency.
Energy efficiency is still as cheap as building a solar collector. If you want to put Exelon out of business, put one solar collector on your roof. And what that does is that the power, they make their money at the peak. And the peak, of course, occurs when the sun is really bright and really hot. Well, if you're generating your maximum capacity at the peak, you're reducing their profits. So every one of us, if we put one solar collector on our roof, would take a nibble out of Exelon's profits and force them to shut the nukes down quicker.
That was Arnie Gunderson, Chief Engineer at Fairwinds Energy Education. Their website is fairwinds.com, and that's an E in Fairwinds, F-A-I-R-E, winds.com. And here's a news flash from Fairwinds. Just as I was completing this program, I heard from Arnie Gunderson with a link to a new video that he cut that covers this subject even more thoroughly. It's called CO2 Smokescreen. New nukes make global warming worse. And the logline reads that the film, quote, uncovers the ludicrously small impact that nuclear power has on saving the Earth from CO2 emissions in contrast with the promises of the nuclear power industry. Well received by fellow experts in the field and filmed by award-winning cinematographer Martin Duckworth, the CO2 Smokescreen is the culmination of 1 year's worth of research and hard work by the Fairwinds crew, Fairwind science advisors, and a group of amazing interns from the University of Vermont. It was filmed at McGill University in Canada and will be available via link on our website, nuclearhotseat.com, under this episode, number 399. Activist shout-out! When it comes to kicking nuclear posterior, Boston-based activist for all seasons Sheila Parks does a bang-up job. She was all over the Green New Deal as soon as the wording hit, and she became one of the first voices pointing out its deficiencies in providing a clear anti-nuclear stance, among many other problems. Sheila published an extensive, in-depth analysis on February 8th on opednews.com. We will link to it on our website, nuclearhotseat.com. This episode is number 399, and that's where you'll find it. This has been Nuclear Hot Seat for Tuesday, February 12, 2019. Material for this week's show has been researched and compiled from nuclear-news.net, deunrenard.wordpress.com, and our dear friend Hervé Courtois, miningawareness.wordpress.com, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, USA Today, New York Times, Bloomberg.com, BloombergEnvironment.com, Beyond Nuclear International, op-ednews.com, ScienceAndGlobalSecurity.org, CNBC.com, Deadline.com, Newsweek, Dr. Gordon Edwards and the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, FXTribune.com, PressOfAtlanticCity.com, NHK.or.jp, Scientific American, DW.com.en, the Soul Dead Cubicle Drones who write press releases for World Nuclear News, and the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. A big shout-out, as always, to Nuclear Hot Seat listeners and followers around the world, in 123 countries on 6 continents and counting. And, of course, we welcome everyone who's listening on our growing network of broadcast stations around the U.S. If you know of a local community radio station that would like to carry Nuclear Hot Seat, let us know. We will get in touch and do our best to bring this about. Please come visit us at the Nuclear Hot Seat blog page. Note that it's the blog page with the red and black logo, not the podcast page, because Facebook messed that up a while back. Thank you, Facebook. When you find the right page, which has all of our most recent episodes on it, you'll be able to click like, follow us, post, and share. You can find all of our back episodes, all 398 of them, at nuclearhotseat.com. Add/blog to the URL, and you'll be able to scan 10 episodes at a time. And if you want to know more about my book, Yes, I Glow in the Dark, 1 Mile from 3 Mile Island to Fukushima, and Nuclear Hot Seat, you can find it on Amazon. This episode of Nuclear Hot Seat is copyright 2019, Libby Halevi and Heartistry Communications. All rights reserved, but fair use allowed as long as proper attribution is provided. This is Libby Halevi of Heartistry Communications, the heart of the art of reminding you that every nuclear reactor creates deadly radioactive waste that lasts forever. So for any New Deal to be genuinely green, it must not include nuclear. Period. There you go. You have just had your nuclear wake-up call. So please, whatever you do, do not go back to sleep, because we are all in the nuclear hot seat.
Nuclear hot seat. What are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat. What have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat. The corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat. It's the bomb.